Okay, well, good afternoon, you guys. What we're going to do here is talk about realism. Realism emerges in Europe around 1850, and it really, actually, to be honest with you, it still exists even today. Some artists tend to work within the realism category. I'm one of them. But anyway, it begins about 1850, and really what happens is we end up with some changes. Now, we've already talked about the Romantic period, and that the Romantic period, it was about chaos and death and things that we cannot control and the imagination and things of that nature. Well, realism counters that. It actually goes like, okay, we're not going to paint anything but what we actually see, what really we do encounter in life. So, matter of fact, one of the artists that actually starts up the realism movement, his name is Gustave Courbet, and he ends up saying, show me an angel and I'll paint one. So it's kind of like, come on, give me the real thing. So it really kind of counters that romanticism idea of, looking to your imagination, looking to your intuition. It's more scientific in approach. So let's go on to the next slide here and take a look at it. Most of the critics, like the academies, like the French Royal Academy, and as well as the English Royal Academy, they hated realism. They call it the cult of the ugly because it really doesn't glorify anything with regard to the human beings. It's really about us and what we deal with on a daily basis. Matter of fact, realism is about what happens to us day after day after day after day, and the things that we encounter. And a lot of it tends to focus on the poor because that's really, what your vast majority of the population are going to be middle class and below, not middle class and above. So if you guys take a look at this particular slide, you can see the cult of the ugly with the realism and really what was happening in society at in the 1800s versus the cult of the beautiful, the academic style, which is beautiful and everything is perfect. And the thing, the women, their bodies, it's not like what you would actually really see in real life because we're lumpy, we're bumpy, we have flaws. There are all sorts of errors with the human body. Really, do you end up, being perfect all the time? So realism is really about daily life. It's actually the mundane. It's about it. They're what we call genre images, those images that are about everyday human activity. Now, the thing is, what really scares the people that are in the academic tradition is that, and if you guys remember when I talked to you folks about the the hierarchy of painting and sculpture, and we had that third category that was called genre painting, and it was about human beings, and just them doing everyday things. Well, the thing is, those paintings were very small. Now, what happens in realism is that we take those everyday paintings that were once very small and kind of insignificant. Now we're going to blow them up to 10 footers. They're going to become or unseat history paintings. This will become history painting. So the genre style or genre category displaces history paintings from this point forward. And the academic traditions, they don't like that. They want it to stay pretty and to have the nymphs and your mythological things, but the people in realism are like, but that isn't real. That isn't what our life is. It's not about gods and goddesses. It's about us just existing from day to day to day and what our activities are. So let's go on to the next thing here. And what are the reasons for the development of realism? Number one, actually, we end up the first industrial revolution we've already talked about from the 1750s or so. Now we're in the second industrial revolution. We end up with steel production, electricity, new chemicals, and oil. It changes our standard of living yet again, and it changes what we see in society and what our clothes are, what our, how we move around, how we get new information, and so forth. So the second industrial revolution influences us. The development of photography, which comes in about 1826, is kind of like when the first photograph comes through. But now photography, you can capture things much more quickly with a photograph. It's much more democratizing, and it can cross, from people that are kind of lower middle class to those that are upper class, and it makes it so that portraits are much easier to get a hold of. Also news events like a civil war, as you guys can see at the bottom uh, of this particular slide, where we have the American Civil War and the dead in the field there, to mannequins up in a storefront, which is on the upper level of pictures as well. So photography really changes the way that the public wants to see facts. So now we're into a much more fact-driven society. Number three, we end up with the emergence of caricature, journals and newspapers and critical writing. That actually changes, and it actually sometimes artists find themselves in jail because they, make political cartoons like Daumier. He's one of my favorite with the Gargantua here with Louis Philippe. But anyway, the whole idea is that we begin kind of addressing issues and being critical of our world leaders, which we should be. And we begin to write about these things, and we begin to also get information out to people at a much faster rate. So, and then probably the most important thing, and it really should be number one, is the Revolution of 1848, which swept across Europe. It is really what we call the Communist Manifesto. Comes through at this point, Karl Marx and Charles Engels, and it's the proletarian revolution. This is when we get change, when the workers begin to unite and they come to the forefront, and it's more important about us, the workers, than royalty. From this point forward, nobody really gives a rat's behind about royalty. It's like, yeah, they maybe are part of the country or whatever, but we, the workers, are really the backbone of everything, and it's us. We determine everything, and it can be your workers from, farmers to your factory workers, to your professionals that are dentists, doctors, professors, scientists. We all fit into this category because we're all the ones that are paying the taxes. We're the real ones that are, which is what life is really supposed to be about. So it's really about being very empirical, and positivism means that you're really looking at the facts and using those as your marker overall too. So really that communist manifesto and the revolutions of 1848, which is about the proletariat rising up and becoming the more important factor in society. That really does change and makes it so that realism comes forward. So let's start out with our first guy. The French are the ones that will move very quickly into the system. Gustave Courbet is our guy that says, "Show me an angel and I will paint one." He is the first person to actually hold his own one-man show. Typically, artists would have to go through galleries or through the academic tradition. Now, he is trained in an academic tradition. He actually comes from the countryside of France, and he's trained in Paris, but some of his work ends up rejected, and he's like, you know what? I'm just going to hold my own show. And this is the first point in which a solo show will go through, held specifically by the artist himself. And this changes everything for us artists. It really does. So this is the first work. The work that I need you guys to remember is Gustave Courbet's The Stonebreakers from 1849. So this is 1 year after the Communist Manifesto comes through. And Courbet is very much real of these men called stonebreakers. He actually saw them on his way. He had jumped off the train. He was going home to Ornans, which is kind of like a coastal area. It's a farmland area in France. But anyway, he was going home and happened to come across these guys. They're basically breaking stones to make ready for a road system that is going to go through. And what I want you guys to notice here, and this is what Courbet wants you to notice as well, the poorness of these two fellas. They're unskilled labor. Well, I don't know if I call them necessarily unskilled, but they're laborers. Let's go with that. Their clothing is tattered. They're locked into a level of poverty. See, keep in mind, Europe, even today in Europe, their ability to get an education is very different than ours. Education is kind of free, not free. I mean, we have to pay for it, but any of you could go to college as long as you hold your grades and that sort of thing. It's not actually like that in Europe. You have to test, and not everybody is allowed to go to school. And if you're not smart enough to pass the test, you don't go. in the United States, we create, community colleges where you can, if you, maybe your high school wasn't quite good enough, or maybe you have to kind of relearn how to learn. You kind of start up in this, and it's also much less expensive than going to a big university. So we kind of start you guys out, at this one. We get you ready to make the next leap to the 4-year institution. That doesn't really happen in Europe, and Europe does not accommodate most of its population as far as trying to educate it. It's really kind of left to the social elite, and those are the ones that end up with the education and the funding for it. But anyway, with these stonebreakers, these men are locked into poverty, probably never going to see another way out. And what I want you to see are the shoes, kind of strapped together with leather. Their clothing is ripped up. Now, obviously, if you're doing this kind of hard labor, you're not going to wear your Sunday best by any means. But the whole point is that Courbet was very much aware of them, and that they are kind of the backbone of society. And again, it is what they have to do day in and day out, whether they're sick, whether they're not. They don't get paid very much. Even though it is hard, back-breaking work. You can even see the pan up above on the right-hand side. You can see a pot that's actually meant for their potatoes. They're going to boil potatoes for their lunch. But it's common everyday things that we manage or that we do that become the real topics. This is it was a huge painting. It was like a 6-footer by 10, something like that. So again, it's this daily, everyday work that would have been a genre painting that would have been very small, 2 decades earlier. And now it's become this huge, monumental, historical painting that isn't very pretty, and it doesn't give you a very good light upon what our societies are. It's more like this is the reality for a lot of people. So anyway, it's no longer about royalty. It's not about that landed gentry. It's about us, the masses, the people that have to work. So in this case, though, we have the working poor and everyday things that are kind of elevated into the number one position, as I had mentioned to you guys before. The reason why I made the allusion to the fact that, this particular painting once was something, it wound up being destroyed during World War II, so you guys are actually seeing a replica of it. It was painted from a photograph that we had of it left over, but when we went through World War II, this painting was actually destroyed. So let's go on here. This is just another Courbet, and again, he's focusing on a funeral, which, it is something that all of us have to go through. We all have to, kind of endure going to them. They're not very fun by any means, not fun at all. It hopefully is not an everyday occurrence, but it is, again, something that we must be a part of. And it's very unusual. You don't usually paint images of burials. And then if you guys notice, right in the center and at the foreground of this work, that's the hole where actually, I think it's his grandfather or else an uncle that is actually going to be buried. But notice how everybody's, I don't know if you guys have been to very many funerals, but you know how people kind of look around, they're kind of not paying attention, they're kind of thinking about their own things, sometimes they're crying as well. That's what this thing is about, and each and every individual in here can actually be identified, and they come from the town that Courbet came from. So it's really an indication of us and our reality and what we are about. So, and again, this is a huge painting. It's like over 10 feet tall, or 10 feet long, excuse me. And so again, to have a large painting of this hopefully not an everyday event, but something we do experience, to elevate it to this very large history painting type size really, again, scares the heck out of the academic traditions. So continuing on here, now this is Millet. He is also a Frenchman, and you guys are looking at the Gleaners from the Salon of 1857, and these women were allowed to come in and pick up what was left over of wheat after it had been harvested. They're the poor. They're the poorest of the poor within society. And what would happen is very wealthy farmers, and you can see the buildings way off in the background of this work where the wealthy farmer and his family would be located. And you can see all of that beautiful grain and the hay and everything that is being transported, ready to be transported. Well, what would happen is the farmers would open up their gates and it was kind of a charitable act, is the way that it was seen. And then the poor were allowed to come in and pick up from the ground any of the wheat pieces that fell off. So that's what these women are. And notice that they're, bent over. I don't know if you guys have ever had to walk bent over like that for very long. Imagine doing that for a couple of hours just so that you could bake a loaf of bread because you're that poor. Again, that's kind of an indication of what society is like at that particular time, and it's not easy for everyone either. And it's kind of like a wake up call, and it's also about, these people that in society many thought were not important, but they really are very, very important. We're all important in the world. So that's kind of what that one was about. Now I want to take you to probably my favorite girl out of the whole thing. She's probably one of my favorite people in the art world. Her name is Rosa Bonheur. Bon means good, and Ur is our, I kind of call her Rosa Happy Hour, because she's happy. That's what her name means, Bonheur. So this is Rosa Bonheur. She she has an interesting past. As a little girl, she was a bit of a pain in the behind as far as going to school. She's a French woman, and her dad and mom actually lived in a commune. The dad was a minor painter, and he was very good, actually. And they lived in a commune that actually believed that the Messiah would be a woman. It was a very progressive system that they lived in. Well, anyway, Rosa was not one of those kids that liked to go to school. She was a bit of a hellion in some ways, and finally the school kind of kicked her out. And she was about 9 when this happened. And so her dad had to teach her at home. Well, what he did, he found that, she was just a pain in the behind. She probably was what we would classify as ADHD today. And they didn't have, terms like that back then. But anyway, what her dad figured out, all right, you work for an hour on your math or your writing or whatever, and then you can have an hour to do your art. And her dad would teach her. That was the way that he kind of made it so that she would stay on top of her tasks and get her education. Well, as Bonheur continued, she does go to the academy. She becomes actually the best painter of animals in the 19th century. She becomes the best. And painting animals was a very important area, and a lot of people sought painters like that. Well, the other interesting thing about Bonheur is that she's a gay woman working at that particular time. And matter of fact, you can see her with pants on in the upper left-hand corner. And you can also see, if we drop to the lower left-hand corner, that's Rosa Bonheur. She's the one that is standing with probably what I would call her life partner, Natalie Micus. Natalie is seated. They stayed together for 40 years. That's a long time. And it kind of makes me smile because Rosa Bonheur had said, had I been a man, I would have married Natalie. The laws didn't allow that at that point in time, but the two women do stay together. We begin in the 1800s, we begin to see more and more women will quite often align together or will live together, sometimes just for the mere purpose that they don't want to have to get married, because once you get married, then the expectation is that you have to have children and that sort of thing. It kind of ties you down, particularly if you want to be a career woman, which she did. Well, anyway, she and Natalie, they last for, like I said, the 40 years. Natalie passes away. I don't know how many years later it is, but Bonheur will end up with an American that wound up writing her biography. The woman's name is Anna Klumpke, and Bonheur will spend the rest of her life with Anna Klumpke, an American. So she has 2 partners in her lifetime that love her dearly, and she really is a spectacular woman. What I like about her, notice with Rosa Bonheur, she is not like the typical Victorian woman. Most women back in that time in the 1800s and even in the early 1900s, women were expected to have long hair. A way for a woman to say, screw the system, was to chop their hair off. And if you notice, she has kind of like a bobbed haircut. There's even an old story out there that was called Bernice Gets a Bob. And it's kind of a way for women to say, no, I'm not going to follow the system. Rosa Bonheur actually wore pants. she had to have a special license from the police to state that she could actually wear pants on any given day, because women would be arrested if they wore pants in public. But Bonheur, when she was at home, and she has a very big, large ranch in France, and when she's at home, she wears pants. She does not wear those stupid, silly dresses. So anyway, I kind of brought in some images here, like with the American women dressing as men as part of a social club, because women are now, by the time we hit the 1800s, they're trying to push harder and harder for equal rights, and they're trying to make their way through a system. And sometimes they're also kind of like, kind of screw you as far as the societal parameters that are put on them, and they'll find ways to rebel, whether it's through their hair, through their clothing, or whatever. Sometimes there are ways for us to get through this. So anyway, let me show you guys Rosa Bonheur's work. These are particularly the work that's called Plowing in the Nivernais, the dressing of the vines. That is not a photograph. That is a painting. That's how tight this woman paints. She is fantastic with her very analytical lines. She is very, very tight. And these paintings are all very, very large. They're 6-footers. They're huge. And these are everyday events, like, going out and plowing your fields, going to a horse fair. Now, what's interesting with Rosa Bonheur, not only she was so good with animal anatomy, she would go to slaughterhouses, which, that's not something I could actually do. It just, I can't stand the smell of it, and I don't like being around that kind of death. That's part of the reason why I don't eat red meat at all. But anyway, she would go to slaughterhouses, and she would wear her pants when she would go there, but she becomes just so familiar with animal anatomy. She's fantastic. Well, if you guys take a look at the work called The Horse Fair down at the bottom here, actually Rosa Bonheur is a horse fairs like this. These would be conducted like in France. They would be in England. I don't know about the United States. I actually don't know our history with regard to that particular part, but usually horse fairs were places where, it's almost like an auction, and places where you'd sell up animals and stock, things like that. Well, anyway, women are not allowed in these places. Well, she gets access to it. What she does is she binds her breasts, she wears the pants. She has short hair, so she's able to kind of blend in with the men. And she said, what an incredible thing to get access to an area where there are no women around. And she said, it's all men. And she said, they behave so much differently when they're just with each other than when they're around women. She said, it's just an incredible thing to go in as disguise and to watch how people interact. So anyway, she is actually in the middle of this particular scene. Can you see the woman? Well, it's not really, you can't tell that it's a woman, but there's a person in blue. There are 2 people in blue. There's one with a horse that is rearing up. That is not her. She's actually the other person that is looking at you, the audience, almost like saying, hey, I'm right here. And her horse is quietly trotting. You can see her back there looking at you. That was always her cue. She would put herself in hunting scenes, in scenes where it's all men, as well as a means of saying, I have penetrated this system. I am here. I have access to this. And again, it's a place that, other women would not get, access to. But what I want you guys to see is this very large painting, beautifully handled, and it's this everyday life on large scale, and absolutely fantastic. I think a Vanderbilt owns one of these. I know that there are 4 copies of this, if I'm not mistaken, and she does sell these things quite readily. She ends up making a ton of money. So she was, again, just such an unusual lady, and I like the fact that she was, kind of questioning the system and pushing for some very interesting rights. So let's continue on, you guys. Just a couple more. Bonheur's farm. She had a farm. They had ostrich and lions. The lions got so doggone big, they actually had to take them to the zoo and keep them there. But she loved living with animals. In matter of fact, she was a great proponent for the rights of animals, just as she was a great proponent for the rights of women. Women and animals were quite often tested on, treated unfairly by men and the system. Animals were quite often, just to give you guys an idea, animals were quite often tested on or torn open, if you will, or operated on without being put under with anesthesia. Rosa Bonheur was a great proponent for, making the animal go to sleep, like with chloroform or something like that while they're being operated on. To us, that is absolutely horrifying to think of that today, that you would actually operate on an animal, cut them open. I mean, the pain that one can only imagine with this. Well, women were great proponents at that point in time because they identified with the animals as not having a voice, as not having a choice in society. And so Rosa Bonheur was a great proponent in stopping what we call live vivisection, meaning live operations, or with the animal being awake. And women became the voice for animals and animal rights, actually. So Bonheur was very, very big in that particular aspect as well. So anyway, I just wanted you guys to see her farm. So let me continue on here. Now, poverty and piety in the 19th century, that's also very mid-19th century, very important too. Daumier, his work is over there on the left-hand side and is called Third Class Carriage. This is actually an oil sketch from 1862, but really what you guys are seeing is actually the modern family. Remember when we first started in the Renaissance, we had the Holy Family, you'd have Mary, baby Jesus, and then you'd have Joseph. Well, now you have the modern family of the 19th century here, and it's a modern Holy Family. It's much more industrial. So let's take a look at the work here. Look at the women that you see in this third class carriage that are facing you, and then the little boy, and then the baby as well. My first question whenever I have you guys look at this is, who is missing in this? And if you think about it, Dad. Dad is the one that is missing. What it looks like we have here right in the middle is the older woman, probably mom. And then she's the mom to the woman that looks like she might be breastfeeding a baby on the left-hand side. And then we have a little boy that might be either the mom's boy, or it could be the boy to the young woman that's breastfeeding. What I want you guys to notice is that the dad isn't there. Now, we don't know, is the dad not there because he was killed? Is the dad not there because he was working? Or is the dad not there because in the French world, and sometimes this happens in the English world as well, it can occasionally happen in the poor worlds of the United States too, the men take off. They, have babies and then they just take off and they don't help take care of their family. So it could be a demonstration of the poor and what happens in these poor classes. That's one possibility. And what I want you guys to notice is there's actually kind of like a triangle formula with this very stable composition that he's using, kind of rising up to the top of the head of the old woman, and then, kind of coming back down, the arm comes back down, comes over with our base and then goes back up, starting with that little boy's arm. And then we have that continuation of that triangle. So a very stable composition, but not a very stable family, and difficult at that, and it's poor. And you guys are looking at what is called third class carriage. This is where the workers and train systems back then, you'd have like your first class carriage, people that are wealthy and they can afford a bigger ticket, sort of like, when you can fly first class in a plane. I've never been able to fly first class. I have no idea what it's like. I have to fly coach because I don't have a lot of money. That's my reality and I hate it. But that's just the way it is. Well, this is third class carriage. This is where your workers, it stinks. They're poor. And what's happening is they're going into the city to work. And you don't really have an image of Dad there. Now, on the other two images that you folks see over on the right-hand side, you do again see those triangle formats. Once again, the one with William Bouguereau where it says indigent family, notice how the people are just so beautiful versus what the French Daumier, what he tends to create. But we also have the Irish famine down at the bottom. 1840s, that's when the Irish, a lot of them come over to the United States. They try to get out because we end up with the potato blight, and we end up with a large amount of people coming over here trying to escape death. They have to migrate to us as well. And a lot of times, even in the United States, we would put up signs that would say, Irish need not apply. You do not get a job. They hated the Irish. It should sound familiar to what is happening sometimes in our country even today. Various points in time in our country when we have mass migration from different places, because those people are trying to run from something, or they're trying to get out of, starvation, nasty things that happen to us. A lot of times what happens is a great deal of fear will come about, and people will be very negative to those folks that are trying to make their way in. Today, we don't even think twice about taking in an Irish immigrant. Oh yeah, come on in. We don't think about it at all, because they're part of us. They've just become a part of us. And the same thing happens anytime you have immigrants coming in. They eventually become a part of us. It's part of the deal. You want to have a country that's lucky enough to be able to take people in. But anyway, sorry about that. I kind of went off on that one. So let's go on to our next image. Actually, let's skip the Daumier with Honoré Daumier with this lithograph. I'm not actually even going to hit you guys with the realism in England with the Pre-Raphaelites. Let's just continue on from this one. Let's go to the Americans and Thomas Eakins. And let me get a drink here so I can kind of wet my whistle. Americans love their realism. We still love it even today because it kind of tells a story. One of my favorite fellas out of this whole time period, and this is like the late 1800s, Thomas Eakins. I adore him because he felt that women should have the same educational experiences as men as artists. And that if men are going to have a nude figure in their life drawing classes, women should too. And women should learn to draw that way. Eakins was a professor at, I think it's the University of Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania School of Design, one or the other. But anyway, he was a fantastic teacher. The problem is this. A matter of fact, you can see Eakins up in the upper left-hand corner there. That's him holding a model. And he's buck naked as well. He hated clothes. He did not like to wear clothes. Well, anyway, Eakins, unfortunately, could you imagine your teachers stripping down like that and holding onto a model in your class? We would get our butts fired so fast it wouldn't be funny. We don't do that sort of thing today. Well, back then you kind of could do that sort of thing. He would go skinny dipping, with his class. It would be the men, not the women. But anyway, we would not do that sort of thing today. But anyway, Eakins, because he does kind of cross the boundary a little bit, he ends up losing his job. He does get fired. And it kind of breaks my heart, but yet it's kind of like, well, I kind of understand too, because he did cross a couple of things that he shouldn't have done. But I love him as a realism painter for the United States. And you guys can see, in the picture below, students in a life drawing class in Pennsylvania Academy. We have a horse in there, and the women are learning. But again, Eakins wanted women to learn from the nude male and the nude female model because that's the best way to work with us. And he also loved photography. He also used that in his class as a means to kind of teach people as well, like what the human body looked like. So let me take you guys forward here. Eakins has a bit of kind of a rough, well, it's not a rough background. He comes from money. But he's a bit of a failure as a Victorian man. Number one, he bought his way out of the Civil War. During the time of the Civil War, in the North, if you came from enough money, and I think it was $500, if I'm not mistaken, if you had $500, you could buy a stand-in to take your place in on the North side for the Union. In my area of the United States, you could buy your way out of it because we had such a high population. In the South, you couldn't do that. The Southerners, they took people from the age of 13 or 14. If you could hold a gun, you went to war, if you were a man. And, the Confederate Army was made up of, kids that were maybe 14 years old up to 85-year-old men, because you didn't have the population. So anyway, Eakins, in my opinion, isn't much of a man as far as that's concerned. He should have stood up and fought, but he had a way of buying himself out of it because he came from money. Eakins does not get married until he's in his 40s, and he never has children. That is also kind of a mark of a failure as a Victorian man. He continues to live with his mom and dad, which is not good either. So there are a lot of things that kind of took away his masculinity. But what's interesting is his paintings do focus very heavily on the masculine male. Eakins started out as an illustrator for magazines and ends up creating these incredible paintings about men and this masculine world of, rowing and sports. Eakins loves sports. So anyway, he painted with a manly quality because what's interesting is realism was often thought of as being kind of a feminine style, which totally blows my mind. But I guess it's because of the detail. Now, I tend to think of it as being much more masculine, with the clarity and empiricism. But anyway, back then it was thought of as being more of a feminine style. But the thing is, he always paints these very masculine subjects, like with the guys rowing. Matter of fact, rowing became a very popular sport here in the United States. We learn it from the English. The English teach the French, and they teach us, how to row quite well. And we end up, having competitions with one another and that sort of thing. So that's actually what you guys are seeing here with the Bigland brothers turning the stake and the Bigland brothers racing, and even John Bigland in a single scull. The Bigland brothers were kind of like the best rowing team that we had in the late 1800s. And so anyway, he really gives you, and actually, matter of fact, the two brothers is Barney and, God, I can't remember if the guy's name is Ralph. We'll assume it's Ralph, but it's Barney and Ralph. Barney was a factory worker, like a factory foreman. Ralph was a lawyer. So it's kind of like you have the brawn, which is your factory worker, and your brain, which is your lawyer, and the two men have to work together in unison to row together, and they kind of complement one another. So it's really about this world, the United States, about how the brawn of us and also the brains of us, we make one harmonious system. And that's really what you guys are kind of seeing here. And it's really what Thomas Eakins was trying to get across too, about this masculinity, that you need not only the brawn, but you need the brains as well in order to make this race a successful race, or to make our country a successful country too. So anyway, as a matter of fact, part of the reason why Eakins is more or less focusing on this masculine racing sort of thing, by the time we hit the 1870s, a lot of the men in the United States had desk jobs. Kind of like your middle class and above, they would tend to have desk jobs, and their hands were softer. It's not like they were doing really hard work and getting calloused and things like that. And in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, there was kind of like a national feeling that men were becoming effeminate, that men were becoming weaker, and they weren't as strong as they used to be because they had desk jobs. They were thinking rather than doing the physical activities. So it kind of, there was a little bit of worry that men were going to lose their edge in some ways or another. And so that's why we think that Eakins actually goes in this direction of really overemphasizing the strength and the arms and the power of a man, because, some of the men, are just sitting behind desks and kind of, not really strong and, except for the brain, that sort of thing. So anyway, that kind of talks about the social anxieties that tend to come with it. But again, you have an everyday event, very clear, very crisp, very clean sort of work. And again, it's kind of like an everyday thing. Women, by the way, too, did race here in the United States. We would race in these sculls, or these boats as well. So just Eakins chose not to paint those. He was really a man's man sort of character. So anyway, this one, excuse me. This is an Eakins as well, called the Gross Clinic. And this is the one that I would really test you guys on quite heavily. We begin to see the growth in professional careers in the United States at this point. And there's a new type of hero. It's kind of like the self-made man, the person that kind of picks themselves up from their bootstraps and, says, I will conquer this. Well, Dr. Gross, who is the figure that you see in the Gross Clinic here, he's like your focal point. Actually, it's more like his forehead is your focal point. He has the gray hair and has a scalpel in his hand. Well, Dr. Gross is a German. He's first generation American, and spoke German when he came over. And he comes from a poor group of people, but he ends up over here, and by hard work and really, putting his nose to the grindstone, he ends up becoming an incredible doctor. And about the time we hit the 1870s, this is when you begin to see the rise of the prestige of doctors at this stage. So, and what happens, I think he was trained under the French system, which at the time the French were better than anybody else as far as medicine was concerned. So anyway, he ends up, training a whole set of doctors, and that's what you guys see in behind him. Can you guys see all of the men that are kind of seated in an auditorium, and what they're doing is they're watching him lecture and show them how to do a particular type of surgery. And so this is how they would train people to become doctors. And this would be in Philadelphia, actually. I think this thing still hangs in Philadelphia too. But anyway, and I think it's at the medical school in Philly as well. But anyway, the surgery that's going on here, you guys, if you look over at the picture, can you see the blue that is, it's actually the feet of the young boy. Those are his socks that he has on. What they're doing is they're operating on his femur. So that's like his upper thigh. And you can see his butt, his little behind, over to the far right, if you will. So it's kind of like he's in fetal position and on his side. There's a doctor up by his face, and the doctor is putting chloroform over him, or ether. What has happened by the time we hit the 1870s, we figure out how to knock people out so that they can go through a surgery, so that they're not, awake through this sort of horrifying thing. And the type of surgery that's taking place, they actually have forceps in this case, which is a new instrument. Plus that chloroform is new as well, because it's a new way to knock somebody out so that they're not awake through this. And what's happening is they're taking those forceps and pulling open this muscle tissue. And what they're doing is, with the scalpels, they're kind of removing a bone spur that is growing on this boy's leg. And if you don't take that bone spur out, actually people become lame eventually. And so what's happening here is quite often people that are poor would become sort of the guinea pigs. They would be the patients that would be operated on, and would be the ones to be kind of like the demonstration model for the young men that are up there in the audience and watching this. So again, this is about a doctor and his brilliance, and notice how the light shines on his forehead, indicating that intellectual capability of the doctor, his control, and his teaching mechanism along with it. So again, everyday life for someone that is a professional, which is what you guys will become. It is what I am. As professionals, we do this sort of thing, and it's part of our everyday life and teaching and being a part of our community. So that's kind of what's happening in this particular case. So again, it's kind of blood and guts. It's reality, truth. Now, a lot of times I'll have students that will ask me, well, what about that lady that's kind of has her hand up over her face? It's like she can't quite handle seeing it. We actually don't know what she's about. Some people have postulated that it's the mom to this young boy. Could be, for all we know, or it is the indication of female emotional qualities being shown in this very masculine world. So we really don't know for sure what her purpose is in there, but she's kind of an interesting counterpoint to this very masculine process that is taking place, because women do not become doctors at this point. Women are not allowed to become doctors. Eventually they will become nurses, but we are not allowed to be doctors at this stage. So let me take you on to the next image. This is just another one with the Agnew Clinic. And again, it's about surgery, and actually a very tough surgery. But you guys don't have to worry about it. I'm just going to go on from here. These are portraits of men and women. What I want you guys to see is that the men are the doers in the Eakins world. We have Professor Henry Rowland, who he's got a spectrometer actually in his lap, and actually the frame all around, it's a bunch of physics formulas and so forth around him. And then we have Professor Rand. So notice that the men all have jobs, but look at these women. They look melancholy, bored, and that was typically what happened to women in the 1800s. If they didn't work, if they came from like a middle class and above family, they didn't work, and it's like, well, what the hell do you do? These women would just almost like rot away mentally. That's why even today we push quite hard for women to have jobs, because dementia sets in if you don't have something to push at you, or sadness, no purpose or what have you. And that's kind of what Eakins is actually referencing in this particular case, is this, the sadness and melancholy and nothing to do versus the masculine world. So anyway, I just want to take you guys forward here. I'm not too worried about his wife Susan and so forth. The last guy that we need to talk about is Winslow Homer. He is actually called the Great American Epic Painter. He will exist from the late 1800s, about actually starts painting, I guess, about 1860s or so. And he stays with us until about 1910. As he ages, he becomes more and more abstract, which is, again, kind of interesting. But he is from the East Coast. Matter of fact, he comes from Maine. And his work shows you the life of the men and women that are part of being at sea, and the fishing communities, which again, it's very, very poor. It's very dangerous as far as the lives or the type of work that they're doing as well. Scares the bloody bejesus out of me, because I don't like water, and I don't like if I can't see land. Scares the heck out of me. But I do like fish. So I do like that herring net and the fog warning. And what I want you guys to see there is, again, it's a snippet of life. It's genre images, but they're painted very, very large. And these dangerous jobs that these people do. And yet there's this incredible monumentality of the human form. Beautifully handled. And and he does even give you a little bit of man against nature. And man usually doesn't win, but yet he keeps it very relevant and very much about what the lives are like for these men and women that work in fishing communities, like that are in Boston and Maine, and all along our eastern seaboard. Okay. So anyway, let me take you guys forward here. Photography. Photography does work its way into our world as well. The Civil War is not actually the first war where we have photography. It's actually the Crimean War, which was in the 1850s, about 1853 or so. But the Civil War is actually one of those wars in which we do have documentation of, the atrocities and the loss. With more than 500,000 of our men in our country lost, whether it's the Union or the Confederate side. It's a very, very bleak stage of American history. Great sadness. In the Civil War, it was thought that, well, it'll just be a few shots and it'll be done. Well, it's 4 years of bloody war and massive losses on both sides, and then we have to rebuild from there. But photography was used as a means to show people in the East what was actually happening. And so it becomes a documentary sort of system that brings that war front to the people so that they really can understand what is happening. Thomas Roach, which is the one that has a dead Confederate soldier from Petersburg, Virginia, 1865. Roach sometimes had to move people, just keep in mind, these photographers, they have a lot of equipment, and they can't go in and take these photographs while the battle is taking place. They have to go in after the battles have taken place. And sometimes Roach, what he would do is he'd actually kind of create a scene, And that's actually what happens in this one with the dead Confederate soldier. What he did, what we think he did, is that he moved that tree trunk, that pine tree, in front of that dead Confederate soldier as a means to kind of give you a foreground, middle ground, and background so that you could kind of escape or get away from that death aspect. But a lot of times we kind of have to question how he set things up. The one down with Alexander Gardner, a home of a rebel sharpshooter, that one, that's another one again where they had to kind of wait until the battle was done, and then they went in and kind of moved the body around a little bit in order to make this one work. And then finally the one with Timothy O'Sullivan and Alexander Gardner, A Harvest of Death in Gettysburg, July 1863. This one probably is the epitome of photography handled so well to document this horrible process. And what I want you guys to see here is in the foreground, notice that we have the men that have passed. Matter of fact, they're being stripped. They're being stripped of their boots by the Confederate Army. They're being stripped of any of their goods or any belongings that would be of value. But we have that lineup, the guys that are in the foreground here, and notice how clear they are. And then as we move back, our clarity starts to get lost, and then it gets hazier and hazier. It's almost like the four horsemen of the apocalypse in the background, and it hazes out into this ghostly sort of atmosphere, which really gives you the magnitude and the sadness and the isolation, loneliness that tends to come with the death, and particularly, after battles and things of that nature. So I wanted you guys to see what photography would do. My voice is starting to go, so I'm going to have to give myself a rest. This is where I will end with realism, okay, you guys? And then I'll start up with some impressionism after this, okay? So that's the end of this particular rotation for you folks for realism.